great hall hung thick and sweet with the smell of wood smoke, stale perfume, and a deep, underlying musk of panic. It was not the kind of scent that signaled comfort or celebration. It was the cloying aroma of human desperation pressed into confined spaces. Medieval life was often characterized by its relentless cycles, the wheel turning without reprieve, harvest to seed, death to birth, plenty to famine, and at the heart of this inescapable rhythm stood womanhood itself. In any given era before the chemical revolution, reproduction was not a choice. It was the structural guarantee of survival. Your body was less a vessel for personal fulfillment and more an essential piece of agrarian machinery. It belonged first to the lineage, second to the lord or husband, and third, if unmarried, to the community's precarious social economy. The sheer density of life in medieval communities meant that accidental pregnancies were not statistical anomalies. They were imminent threats to order. Consider a bustling manorial village. The ratio of births to deaths was breathtakingly high, a continuous, bloody pageant of existence. Each successful birth represented both a miracle and an immediate crisis, for it swelled the population, demanding more land, more food, more resources, a palpable weight that pressed down on every soul. And when the panic began, particularly in the overheated quiet of a manor hall like this, the immediate response was not one of calm discussion or sophisticated planning. It was sheer, visceral terror. The problem of unwanted pregnancy was not merely personal, it was structural. It threatened the perceived equilibrium of the family, the economic stability of the household, and sometimes, by extension, the political standing of its masters. To be inconveniently pregnant meant to be socially disruptive. The social contract of the high Middle Ages prized fertility above almost all other virtues, excepting perhaps piety itself. This created a paradox. While society lionized motherhood as the highest calling, it simultaneously enforced stringent rules on reproductive failure and unwanted beginnings. A woman who failed to conceive was subject to suspicion. A woman who conceived when she was not meant to be, or could not sustain that child, faced an altogether different kind of scrutiny. There was no concept of detached bodily autonomy as we understand it today. The body was porous, a site of constant negotiation between biology and law, desire and duty. A young, unmarried woman facing early conception found herself suspended in a dizzying ethical limbo. Her value hinged on her immaculate availability, and this accidental state threw that delicate calculus into immediate disarray. The desperation crystallized in the architecture of these encounters. People gathered in halls not to celebrate, but to whisper, their hushed voices weaving intricate tapestries of fear and suggestion. They exchanged looks that spoke volumes about social consequence. Suspicion for the young maid caught too near a man's confidence. Quiet anxiety for the wife, whose cycle felt uneven, profound regret for the body that had suddenly betrayed its assumed control. The emotional landscape was always oversaturated. Everything, the rich smell of beeswax candles, the clatter of pewter tankards, the heavy velvet drapes, seemed to amplify the tension beneath the surface. The air vibrated with the unsaid. The whispers about herbs that might halt a cycle, the quick fixes involving fever and sweat, the desperate searching for knowledge that was inherently dangerous. The prevailing mindset was one of immediate crisis management, lacking any long-term, medically informed approach to population control. Knowledge, where it existed regarding reproduction, was fragmented, passed down through secretive female lines, or hoarded by certain literate apothecaries, whose remedies were often based on folklore rather than fundamental biology. It is crucial to understand the sheer weight of this inevitability. Without dependable knowledge, without a reliable shield against conception that was safe and subtle, the body operated under a kind of terrible primal law. The cycle dictated its own terms, forcing individuals into immediate, drastic emotional, and often physical responses simply because they were human and capable of bearing life. This early chapter is less about the mechanics of contraception itself and more about the devastating pressure that motivated all subsequent efforts to find a way around it. It was a pressure born of profound social anxiety, economic instability, and a deep-seated fear of being out of control. A lack of control felt both over one's own fertile body and over the uncertain future of the entire community. We found ourselves in the muddy trenches of pre-modern gynecology, a field less concerned with biology than it was with sheer dramatic necessity. The modern world, mercifully equipped with chemistry and statistical analysis, has given us an armful of effective options. But before that era dawned, controlling one's fertility was not a question of efficacy. It was a performance art piece staged against the backdrop of absolute panic. If modern methods are reliable and systemic, medieval attempts were deeply individualistic, ritualistic, and often steeped in outright delusion. Welcome to the realm of folklore medicine, where scientific impotence mingled freely with potent herbal remedies, creating what we can charitably call failed science. If you needed protection, your first stop was probably not a reputable apothecary, but rather a dusty tome filled with arcane instructions passed down by nervous grandmothers. These texts whispered promises of prevention, potions brewed from spices, leaves, and things that sounded dangerously exotic. They imagined a literal shield for the body, woven from flora and faith. Consider, if you will, the concept of the prophylactic herb. Plants whose very reputation was built upon their perceived ability to interfere with divine timing. Rosemary, thyme, rue each possessed medicinal qualities, certainly, but more importantly in this context, were imbued with mystical protective powers. They weren't just ingredients, they were incantations mixed into a poultice. The preparation methods themselves suggest less chemistry and more kitchen charlatanism. We talk of consuming complex mixtures, sometimes a tincture, sometimes a heavily spiced broth, often consumed on an empty stomach to maximize and probably contaminate the effect. These remedies operated under the assumption that pregnancy was simply a metabolic process that could be tipped off course, redirected, or neutralized by introducing foreign agents. The logic, as far as we can retroactively grasp it, was that if enough strange things were introduced into the system, nothing would stick, least of all the conceptus, but efficacy proved to be the greatest hurdle in the entire enterprise. These mixtures varied wildly depending on region, status, and frankly, the mood of the practitioner. A courtly noblewoman might be advised a highly refined, expensive blend involving costly spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, meant to subtly disrupt the internal humors, a suggestion that class somehow mitigated biological failure. Meanwhile, a peasant woman facing imminent unwanted pregnancy would receive something much more direct, perhaps a poultice of oak bark applied vaginally, smelling faintly earthy and desperate. The most fascinating remedies were often those involving physical objects, or wands in the poetic parlance. These weren't magic wands per se, they were medicinal tools. We are referring to herbs stuffed into catheters, or certain aromatic bundles meant to be introduced into the body, believed by tradition to act as a kind of internal deterrent. The sheer absurdity is breathtaking. To believe that a carefully bundled sprig of wormwood could reliably prevent conception speaks volumes about the desperation and the overwhelming need for control. It elevates reproductive timing from a physiological function to a matter of ritualistic warfare. Folklore, naturally, amplified this entire enterprise until it became indistinguishable from magic. The herbal guidelines often overlapped with domestic remedies meant more for digestive distress than for preventing gestation. They mixed advice on childbirth, recovery, with preconception prophylaxis. Did the treatment work by its advertised botanical power? Or was the perceived safety derived from the act of following a ritual, from engaging in a structured performance of prevention itself? The very adherence to the cure became part of the desired outcome. The danger inherent in these methods could not be overstated. These herbs and spices were potent things, effective against stomach ailments or minor fevers, but introducing them into delicate reproductive systems without understanding their complex interactions with hormones, if that concept even existed, was a terrifying gamble. Some components might simply cause acute digestive distress. Others carried unknown toxins. The line between efficacious preventative measure and accidental poisoning was razor thin, visible only to the modern palate. And this is where we confront the central tragedy of medieval attempts at family planning. They were fundamentally reactive. They lacked systemic knowledge. Knowledge today builds upon understanding, a deep comprehension of hormonal cycles, sperm viability, and implantation theory. Medieval efforts, by contrast, operated in a vacuum of biological data, relying instead on anecdotal evidence, mythological parallels, and the powerful suggestion that if enough strange ingredients were consumed, destiny would simply get confused. Furthermore, these remedies often assumed blame rather than addressing cause. If contraception failed, it was not an indictment of the herbs or the poultice. It was a sign of failing virtue, a cosmic injustice, or a flaw in the woman's own constitution. The failure thus reinforced social anxieties, making the quest for reliable bodily autonomy even more desperate, and consequently drawing practitioners into deeper realms of dubious practice. It established a pattern. Whenever human life's great mysteries, such as gestation, crossed with economic or social instability, the default mechanism was not scientific research, but an escalating reliance on myth. The body became a text, constantly being rewritten by anxious tradition and poorly understood botany. From the powerful spices of wealthy households to the simple desperation whispered over in shadowed alleyways, contraception in this era was less science and more an elaborate negotiation with fate itself. It suggests that until reproductive life could be framed purely as a biological function, it would always, inescapably, be treated as a matter of moral failure or divine intervention. A perilous and often darkly comical history of human panic. After exploring the dubious poultices and the exotic, often dangerous spices of herbology, we turn our attention to a different battlefield entirely. The arena is not the woman's womb, but the man's composure, a commodity both highly valued and heartbreakingly unreliable in medieval society. We thought contraception was merely the burden of femininity, relegated to whispered spells and uncomfortable poultices applied by anxious apothecaries. But control over reproduction, that eternal human scramble for stability, belonged equally, if not more dramatically, to men. The problem, as historians recount with a weary sort of exasperation, wasn't always chemical. Sometimes it was purely behavioral. Medieval society had an intricate, deeply flawed understanding of anatomy and desire. Much of this understanding flowed through the lens of humoral theory, where everything, including sexual fluids, was believed to be a complex balance of 4 fundamental elements: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To manage reproduction, men were thus advised not just on herbs, but on their overall constitution, what they ate, and how they maintained their inner warmth. This led us to the spectacular cultural art form that we call withdrawal. The concept was was shockingly simple in its premise. If you withdrew your semen before ejaculation, conception was averted. In theory, it sounds almost laughably easy, a mere gesture requiring disciplined self-restraint. Yet, for medieval men, this required a profound and ongoing commitment to emotional and physical discipline that few could maintain for long. Withdrawal was not merely a biological technique. It was a social performance. It demanded a certain kind of masculine control, an ideal which society simultaneously lauded and critiqued. To successfully practice withdrawal suggested self-mastery, temperance, and thus respectable citizenship. Failure, conversely, did not imply weakness in character alone. It often carried the stigma of poor constitution or even moral failure, suggesting an inability to govern one's own impulses. The literature we examine is full of such advice, disguised as medicinal manuals or ethical guides. They spoke of the necessity of regulating libido through rigorous exercise, sometimes recommending specific types of venery or dietary regimens designed to cool the blood and reduce overheated passion. We read accounts detailing specialized exercises meant to keep men physically exhausted but emotionally buoyant, a true contradiction that suggests immense confusion regarding the very nature of desire. The theoretical underpinning was flawed from the start. The concept often failed to account for seminal fluid's capacity for survival, or even pre-ejaculatory droplets carrying viable material. But in an age grappling with the inexplicable, the cyclical timing of menstruation, the sudden violence of childbirth, the capriciousness of harvests, a simple physical act offered a comforting illusion of scientific mastery. Furthermore, the cultural weight attached to manhood meant that reproductive failure could be misinterpreted as something far deeper than mere biology. A man's potency was often conflated with his social value, his honor, and his familial duty. If he failed at this delicate balancing act, it threatened not just the household's continuity, but his entire standing in the community. This pressure manifested across social strata. For the peasant farmer, withdrawal might be a desperate measure undertaken far from civilized scrutiny, dictated by the brutal need to manage generational expansion with limited resources. For the knight, it was tied to martial prowess and reputation. Failure suggested not only infertility, but possibly cowardice or lack of masculine spirit. And for the courtly gentleman, here withdrawal became an intricate part of emotional courtship itself, a demonstration of controlled passion used in poetry and allegory. The poem and the manual often treated sex not as a messy physical act, but as a highly stylized negotiation between willpower and irresistible desire. It was a problem addressed with eloquent prose about virtue, when sometimes all that was required was chemistry. Yet, despite this widespread cultural adoption, the practice remained fraught with difficulty. semen is surprisingly resilient. It can survive in various bodily fluids for considerable time. Moreover, what constitutes complete withdrawal varies wildly. Some texts advised meticulous pre-care of the body, while others simply stressed sheer willpower, suggesting that masculinity could be achieved through nothing more than persistent self-denial. The resulting narrative is one of profound systemic failure. The supposed solution was so conceptually simple, the man simply choosing not to impregnate a woman. Yet, its practical execution was undermined by biology and bolstered only by the overwhelming societal need for an answer. It speaks less of enlightened male self-control and more of a collective masculine anxiety that demanded visible, demonstrable proof of enduring sexual power, even when such proof proved wildly unreliable. The sheer farce of relying on willpower to solve fundamental biological problems remains one of history's most darkly hilarious institutional failures. In the wake of folklore remedies and pseudo-scientific poultices, where failure was simply another whisper of moral failing, society turned to methods that required far less ritual and infinitely more desperation. The gentle science of herbs gave way to the brute reality of toxicity. We move now from the absurdity of a blessed spice blend to the deep, terrifying corner of human panic, the consideration of poisons. This was not an educated medical choice. It was a collapse into radical last resort. When conception itself was treated as a fate worse than death, people sought remedies drawn from the very edges of knowledge, materials that blurred the line between medicine and outright chemical warfare. The records are often fragmented, whispered through hushed tavern corners, or recorded in hastily scrawled, fearful monastic texts we treat with extreme caution. The human impulse for control, when denied by nature, has a terrible knack for turning inward. If preventing life was complicated enough, ending it, or attempting to redirect its flow violently, became an intensely private, profoundly dangerous endeavor. These were not guidebook remedies. They were poison lore, the desperate knowledge passed down when all other avenues had failed or been deemed too expensive for survival. The substances involved spanned a horrifying spectrum. We are discussing anything from potent herbal abortifacients, concocted in deep, muddy cauldrons far from clean scholarly scrutiny, to entire categories of toxic materials. Think of powerful emmenagogues taken backward, or botanical agents notorious not for gentle easing, but for their sheer disruptive potency within the female body. The medieval concept of a safe remedy was inherently flawed because it sought control over biological mechanisms that defy mere recipe following. The goal was almost always termination, whether intended gestationally or simply through inducing extreme physical distress to prevent conception in the first place. Failure often resulted just in failed contraception, but genuine illness, hemorrhaging, and death. This is where the panic metastasized from social anxiety into acute medical risk. Imagine a world without modern pharmaceuticals, when birth control became an immediate life or death necessity for survival, for maintaining economic viability or social standing. The line between desperate medicine and accidental poisoning vanished entirely. The perceived efficacy of these poisons often relied on folklore potency more than botanical accuracy. They were remedies whispered among the destitute, those who had little left to lose, and therefore embraced risk as a form of agency. The sheer difficulty in recording this history is staggering. These practices were intensely taboo, deeply private acts carried out far from the jurisdiction of official physicians or chroniclers. The evidence we have often comes indirectly, through legal accusations of miscarriage, induced by natural causes, accused of causing harm when they simply sought bodily autonomy, or through the pharmacological inventories of later periods that catalogued such agents. These toxic remedies represent a profound breakdown of medical ethics, driven solely by reproductive desperation. It highlights how deeply intertwined survival was with gestation in pre-modern life. If you could not control your body's innate functions, if you were subject to the unpredictable whims of fertility and famine, then the attempt to chemically override those functions became a central pillar of societal panic. The knowledge surrounding abortifacients, for instance, was dangerously diffuse. It mixed legitimate herbal medicine intended to treat menstrual irregularities or pain with agents intended solely to disrupt implantation or early pregnancy. The risk was exponential. Misidentification of dosage, contamination of ingredients, the sheer potency of certain natural toxins, all factors stacked up against the fragile human body. Furthermore, this desperation had social ripple effects. A woman who attempted such a remedy carried enormous stigma. She wasn't just failing to conceive, she was publicly viewed as either morally corrupt or dangerously unhinged. Her act of trying to chemically manage her reproductive fate often resulted in further physical and social ruin. The Poison's Whisper, therefore, is not merely an anthology of toxic ingredients. It is the sound of a society at its limits, a culture forced to confront biological inevitability with chemical shortcuts. It speaks volumes about how precious and how fragile the commodity of bodily autonomy was perceived to be in those difficult times. We see the tragic arc here. First, the social panic over pregnancy, then the pseudo-scientific performance of prevention, and finally, the descent into tangible, volatile risk. This escalating cycle demonstrates that for centuries, before reliable contraception became a modern possibility, every single reproductive dilemma was treated not as a medical problem requiring careful management, but as an existential crisis demanding radical chemical intervention. The gravity of this period requires us to look away from the black humor and face the cold truth. These methods were fraught with genuine peril. They represent human beings operating at the absolute edge of what nature allowed them, desperate enough to risk poisoning themselves simply for a sliver of control over their own reproductive destiny. If the medieval world had a contraceptive pamphlet, its most glorious section would have been dedicated to what was simply absent. It is an empty space in our understanding, a void represented by perfect prophylactic safety, the shield that could be worn and discarded without fanfare or ritual. When we talk about coital condoms, we are speaking of an ideal, a clean, elegant barrier against biological messiness. Yet, for the people who lived under the weight of demographic certainty, this concept was less a medical breakthrough and more a dangerous whispered rumor. Imagine the sheer lack of material reality. There were no sophisticated vulcanized rubbers, no sterilized materials derived from chemistry that would only arrive in the age of global industry. Protection existed primarily in the realm of textiles, or sometimes simply nothing at all. Any attempt to replicate this barrier was fraught with immediate limitations. The permeability of natural fabrics, the unpredictable sourcing of skin-like material, and the utter difficulty of maintaining sterility when the very air carried sickness. This absence did not lead to scientific disinterest. It fueled legend. In a culture where control over one's reproductive capacity meant economic stability, social rank, and even spiritual purity, the inability to physically shield oneself became a profound cultural trauma. The condom transformed from a simple preventative device into a mythological object, a symbol of lost knowledge or forbidden magic. When condoms were discussed in dusty texts, they were not treated as scientific implements, but as philosophical concepts. They represented the ultimate severance, the ability to engage in pleasure and biological risk while maintaining complete detachment. This detached control was often read with intense suspicion, sometimes even classified alongside other forms of moral decline or heresy. To discuss its efficacy, or lack thereof, was to tread carefully through a minefield of piety, law, and biology. The conceptual barrier was always more appealing than the practical one. It allowed people to imagine agency where only biological fate existed. The story of sexual safety moved away from empirical method towards narrative device. The condom became less about rubber and more about the power of human imagination, the promise of a boundary that could be drawn, even if it couldn't be realized. This psychological void was a fertile ground for misunderstanding and myth-making. Lacking the physical barrier meant that folklore stepped in to fill the gap. If one could not stop the consequence mechanically, then one must confuse it ritually or chemically. This is where we see the fascinating overlap between sex education and superstition. The inability of the coital condom to exist forced medieval thinkers back into the comforting, if dangerous, realm of herbology. If nature provided no physical shield, surely some blessed plant compound could mimic the protective properties. The gap left by modern technology was thus bridged by pre-modern magic. It taught an uncomfortable lesson about human panic, that when true safety is impossible, people will substitute a plausible story for a reliable barrier. They would replace chemistry with charm and physics with piety. The desire for this invisible safeguard, this conceptual coital condom, showed the deep yearning for detachment from fate, a longing to treat reproduction not as an inevitable biological cascade, but as a manageable social event. The lack of material safety meant that the pleasure itself was forever stained by consequence. Every intimate moment became imbued with high stakes, the knowledge constantly at hand that the boundary could be crossed, and the resulting fallout messy, profound, and sometimes deadly. The legend of the condom, therefore, does not just represent a piece of lost technology. It represents the unattainable peace of mind, the wish for a perfect safety net that only later centuries would manage to weave out of vulcanized rubber, far removed from the whispers and desperate prayers of the medieval hall. It remains one of history's most profound absences, forcing us to study not what they knew, but what they desperately wished was possible. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval life, every body was tallied not by its unique spirit or labor, but by its reproductive potential. A woman's worth was measured in potential pregnancies and successful births, a metric that placed her existence under constant, immense pressure. Before any scientific understanding of choice, reproduction was fundamentally an economic commodity, managed by the expectations of family, lord, husband, and community. To be born was to enter this deeply stratified system, where personal autonomy was a luxury few could afford, especially when it came to controlling one's own fertile body. The greatest pressure, therefore, was not biological, it was sociological. It rested on the perceived control of the woman herself. Her reproductive life became public property, an indicator of her value and adherence to social order. Whether she remained a pristine virgin or passed through the crucible of marriage and motherhood, every phase dictated her standing in the community. To deviate from this expected timeline, to remain unmarried but fertile, for example, could place a woman in a precarious legal and economic position. Consider the pressure on the maiden, the untouched vessel, whose purity was perhaps the most valuable asset she possessed. Her virginity was less an attribute of character and more a form of transferable collateral. It guaranteed her value to her future husband's lineage, cementing alliances between landed families. This commodity made her body subject to intense scrutiny. Every glance, every whisper, and indeed, even every bodily secret became potential evidence used to negotiate her market price. The same relentless gaze fell upon the married woman. For her, reproductive success was expected year after year, not just out of biological imperative, but out of social duty. Her failure to conceive was often interpreted not as a medical issue, but as a moral failing. It suggested an imbalance in temperament, a flaw in devotion, or even spiritual deficiency. In this deeply patriarchal view, the body simply could not disobey its inherent societal mandate. This expectation created a silent terror among women, the terrifying prospect of having no perceived control at all. An unpredictable cycle meant social destabilization. A sudden pregnancy outside of sanctioned marriage was nothing short of a crisis that jeopardized not just the woman's safety, but the stability of her entire kin group. And so, while previous chapters detailed the physical desperation, the herbs, the poisons, the withdrawal theory, this chapter must focus on the internal war. The woman lived with the knowledge that her deepest, most private biological processes were public matters of record, subject to interpretation and judgment by men who held all the power. The resulting anxiety meant that contraception was rarely viewed through a lens of personal freedom. It was always framed as an act of necessity for the survival of asterisk, the family asterisk, or asterisk, the lineage asterisk. The desired outcome was never "I do not want to get pregnant," but rather, this pregnancy must happen at the correct time, under the approved circumstances. This subtle but profound shift is crucial because it transformed the individual's desire into a matter of public performance. One did not merely take herbs for oneself. One performed ritualistic prevention asterisk for asterisk the community. The sheer weight of this societal architecture meant that many of the early contraceptive methods were inextricably linked to spiritual practice, religious observance, and social performance. They were less chemical interventions and more theatrical rituals designed to convince both themselves and others that reproductive flow could be managed by virtue alone. A poultice was not just medicine, it was a testament to one's piety. An abstinence rule was not merely personal discipline, it was proof of moral rectitude. This psychological dimension is the true curse of the medieval woman. The body itself becomes evidence in a legal, economic, and spiritual trial. She must constantly prove her worth through its disciplined function, its ability to bear children when and where society demands it. Any perceived flaw in that functionality, any delay or accident, immediately triggered profound social panic. The unintended pregnancy became not merely an inconvenient event, but a public scandal, threatening the fabric of kinship ties and economic security. The lack of reliable physical control amplified the reliance on performance, on rituals, folklore, and emotional discipline. If chemistry could not provide certainty, then morality had to step in and pretend to fill the vacuum. The body was thus perpetually under surveillance, a living ledger book whose entries determined status and survival. In this relentless scrutiny, the desire for absolute personal control was trapped beneath layers of patriarchal expectation, making any attempt at genuine reproductive autonomy an almost unheard of heresy against the established social order. We have navigated the panic of biology throughout our journey, from the desperate herbal poultices to the silent terror of the void. But sometimes, in the face of genuine biological failure, the perceived inability to conceive, or worse, an unwanted miscarriage, the medieval mind did not seek a diagnosis, it sought a culprit. And when science failed utterly, theology and superstition filled the chasm. This leads us into one of the darkest intersections of history: reproductive struggle and accusation. In the high drama of the late medieval manner, the failure to conceive was rarely filed neatly under biological complication. It was something far more sinister, much easier for society to categorize and punish. The Heretical Pharmacopeia is not just a collection of failed medicines. It is a repository of deeply ingrained social anxieties. When bodies refused to bend to expected reproductive rhythms, the failure was swiftly transferred from the uterus to the spirit. To be unable to bear children when society demanded progeny was viewed not merely as bad luck or poor diet, though those accusations certainly followed, but as a profound moral failing. And in an age where morality and magic were indistinguishable concepts, that failure quickly accrued layers of spiritual guilt. Consider the suspicion placed upon women who struggled with infertility. The frustration was palpable, radiating out from bedrooms into the public square. If the body could not perform its expected function, what then? Was it a punishment from a displeased deity? Or worse, the evidence of malevolent interference? The very act of having difficulty reproducing became fodder for suspicion. It suggested an imbalance that could not be cured by simple spices or blessed herbs. It required something radical, something bordering on the supernatural. This is where the concept of witchcraft enters the narrative, fundamentally linking medical impotence to accusations of magical malice. The perceived inability to carry life was reframed as a refusal to cooperate with natural order, a kind of spiritual rebellion. In this fraught environment, every reproductive failure became potential evidence. If one woman's fertility declined mysteriously, she might not be seen merely as aging. She could be suspected of having lost her grace, or worse, having opened herself to darker forces that interfered with the natural cycle of life and death. The failure was no longer a private domestic crisis. It was a public spiritual emergency. The resulting pharmacopoeia, therefore, is profoundly dangerous because it merges pharmacology with paranoia. These remedies were not designed merely for hormonal regulation or uterine support. They were often imbued with protective wards, apotropaic symbols, and specific rituals intended to root out the suspected magical source of the problem. The magic employed was consequently reciprocal. One did not simply take a potion for bad periods. One might consume a mixture meant to shield the body from curses, while simultaneously ensuring conception. A hazardous cocktail of biochemistry and blasphemy. The boundaries between healing and harming were porous, easily breached by fear. The accusation often functioned as a control mechanism, enforcing adherence to rigid societal norms about what bodies should do. A woman whose biology deviated from the acceptable rhythm was effectively placed under suspicion regarding her spiritual alignment. Her struggle became proof of her perceived deficiency in virtue, or evidence that she was actively inviting disorder. This dangerous convergence meant that reproductive failure carried an enormous social cost, a tax paid not with silver coins, but with reputation and, potentially, life itself. The desperation to control the ultimate biological inevitability led people to consult practitioners who trafficked not just in roots and tinctures, but in dark knowledge and spiritual power. The sheer overlap between medical impotence and accusations of maleficium is what makes this period so horrifyingly complex. It demonstrates that for medieval society, reproductive life was never a matter solely of biology. It was fundamentally an ethical performance. The womb was viewed as the site where divine will met human fallibility, and if failure occurred, both were implicated. The heretical Pharmacopeia is thus not just about poisons or spices. It's a testament to the deep collective anxiety that when fundamental biological control slips away, humanity instinctively searches for an external source, be it celestial punishment, moral impurity, or the whisper of dark magic, to explain its vulnerability. And in doing so, they created methods whose inherent danger far outweighed any possible relief. We thought the management of unwanted life was a purely matter of desperation, confined to hushed corners and forgotten apothecaries. But history reveals something far grander and far more cynical, that reproductive failure, or even prevention, quickly became an industry. By chapter 8, we move past the desperate poultice or the whispered ritual. We enter the age of commerce. Reproduction, it seems, was not merely a biological reality fraught with panic, but a commodity to be traded, marketed, and monetized. The very act of wanting to control one's own fertility placed incredible strain on nascent economic structures. If prevention was valuable enough to inspire witch crashes and desperate toxicology, it was certainly valuable enough for profit. The early medieval marketplace rapidly absorbed this intense biological anxiety, transforming esoteric remedies into marketable goods. And when a problem is profitable, the solutions are always sold by the highest bidder. This chapter takes us deep into the logistics of alchemical oils and exotic spices used in pseudo-contraceptives, items that often traveled along the most robust trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the northern reaches of Europe. Consider, for instance, the potent allure of frankincense or myrrh when packaged not merely as incense for prayer, but as a prophylactic shield for conception. The appeal was threefold: spiritual purification, physical efficacy, and social status. A woman purchasing a highly priced bundle of spices and herbs wasn't just attempting to prevent pregnancy. She was performing a visible act of economic power and ritualistic piety. She signaled that her capacity for self-control, or at least the appearance of it, was tied to her ability to afford specialized, luxurious commodities. The apothecaries became crucial gatekeepers. These were not merely herbalists, they were early pharmaceutical marketers, blending empirical knowledge with potent doses of unfounded mysticism. They managed scarcity, manufacturing demand, where true scientific certainty was non-existent. Imagine the scene: a bustling market square in a major city like Salerno or London, filled with stalls piled high, with jars containing substances ranging from viper dung to pulverized fox teeth, all marketed under the grand promise of reproductive control. The pitch wasn't based on verifiable chemistry. It rested entirely on suggestion and tradition. The sheer weight of accumulated folklore sold at an exorbitant price. This early commercialization process reveals a profound truth about human panic: that when technology fails to provide certainty, commerce rushes in to fill the void with spectacle. The seller did not have to prove efficacy. They only had to convince the buyer that their social standing, or indeed her very life, depended upon the purchased mixture. As trade networks solidified, so too did the taxonomy of prevention. Different regions began specializing in specific remedies, creating what we can view as early branded health products. The texts detailing these preparations become a fascinating mix of botanical science and commercial exaggeration. They listed dosages with scientific precision: a pinch of root here, half a ladle of oil there, while concurrently maintaining an aura of occult mystery that kept the average consumer suitably terrified and trusting. This was capitalism's earliest grasp on female biology, defining potential not by intrinsic physical reality, but by purchasable ingredients. The aristocracy, of course, drove the most expensive segment of this market. For them, contraception became a subtle art form, an extension of their social performance. The ability to delay or manipulate progeny was tied directly to dynastic wealth and political influence. They did not seek cheap herbal poultices. They commissioned entire alchemical compounds, blends rumored to be perfected by foreign mystics, or incorporating rare spices flown in from the far eastern empires. This elevated reproduction management from a necessity into an item of diplomatic luxury. It was this sophisticated, stratified market that ultimately gave birth to a highly detailed and deeply flawed reproductive infrastructure. The more complex the perceived problem, the more difficult it was to prevent conception, the more lucrative the market became. Control over one's own life cycle was reimagined as an asset class. You didn't just buy herbs, you bought security, status, and the appearance of perfect moral discipline. Failure to conceive often meant not only disappointment, but a visible failure in one's investment portfolio. The goods purchased had failed their sacred duty. This commercialization effort was deeply flawed for obvious reasons. The volatile nature of ingredients, the differing interpretations across borders, and the sheer biological chaos of the human body meant that many cures were nothing more than expensive powders mixed with great marketing flair. Yet, it marked a crucial pivot point. The understanding that reproductive anxiety could indeed be systematically capitalized upon, the apothecary's ledger became as valuable, and perhaps as ethically dubious, as any royal charter. It recorded not just sales of medicinal herbs, but the inventory of societal anxieties and the endless demand for bodily mastery. And so, we move from mere panic to structured industry, realizing that while the chemistry remained miserably rudimentary, the economic mechanism surrounding reproductive control was proving astonishingly sophisticated. The desire for choice had been industrialized long before the world understood what choice truly meant. The chronicles of human panic are remarkably persistent. We have traversed the wild, feverish years where every conception was a potential crisis, and every failure to conceive was an omen whispered across generations. Through the dusty remedies of poultices and the dangerous whispers of poison, we have seen how absolutely inextricable life and reproduction were from social order itself. The sheer weight of that reality, the crushing certainty that existence would continue regardless of individual desire or choice, is difficult to truly fathom. It colored every single attempt at prevention, lending them a patina of both deep ritual and utter desperation. To survive, the medieval period was often to navigate this precise tension, the need for self-preservation battling against the absolute gravitational pull of biological reality. The body, in those times, belonged not primarily to its wearer, but to the community, to lineage, and to the overarching stability of the household. Reproduction was thus less a matter of personal autonomy and more an act of communal arithmetic, a carefully managed resource, valued both for the life it promised and the labor it would entail. We witnessed so many attempts at control, the herbal smearing of supposed preventative power, the delicate charade of withdrawal in the gentleman's parlor, the terrifying plunge into toxic substances when all else failed. Each method, each belief, whether rooted in folklore or desperate chemistry, speaks to a singular truth: that humanity has always sought an escape hatch from biological inevitability. And what remains after centuries of such panicked ingenuity? Only memory. The remembering of failure is often harder than the act itself. It is in surviving these years of profound reproductive anxiety that we find our clearest understanding of human nature and social fragility. Those who lived through it learned resilience, a quiet strength not found in a potent tincture or an elaborate performance, but in simply continuing to breathe and exist within those unyielding structures. The narrative moves beyond the act of contraception itself. It settles instead on the archaeology of struggle. We are left with the aftermath, the trauma, the social costs, and the deep scars etched onto the body politic, the collective memory that whispers warnings across the centuries. The survivors did not merely survive physical hardship. They survived the constant emotional weight of knowing that their very presence carried such immense reproductive potential, a potential always subject to community decree, economic need, or sudden biological whim. The knowledge amassed, whether true or fantastical, became part of the collective historical record, a tapestry woven from half-truths and vital necessity. It taught us, perhaps more than any book ever could, that desire for control often breeds only a deeper form of magical thinking. When modern chemistry provided its first tenuous solutions, it merely replaced one set of dangerous fallacies with another. Consider the remarkable transition from the whispered instructions about specific spices meant to block life in the womb, passing through the elaborate commercial market of apothecaries, and culminating in the quiet, sterile packaging of the modern pharmaceutical world. The principles, the profound human fear of choice, the desperate need for a reliable shield have barely changed at all. We have simply exchanged the dubious poultice for the complex hormonal regimen and the dangerous herbal decoction for the precise chemical process. This shift is perhaps the most sobering conclusion we can draw from this entire historical survey. It suggests that technological advancement does not equate to emotional or societal maturity. Instead, it often merely offers a more efficient, more lethal means of managing persistent anxieties. The core human drama remains utterly unchanged. How do we negotiate the brutal reality that life, by its very nature, is unasking and relentless? How do we claim sovereignty over a body that society continually claims ownership of? The surviving accounts are littered with lessons learned at terrible cost. They warn against mistaking ritualistic performance for true efficacy, cautioning against the seductive myth of absolute prevention, whether achieved through sheer willpower or advanced science. The story of medieval contraception is thus not just a medical history, it is a cautionary epic about human aspiration versus biological inertia. It is a testament to the endless, agonizing effort required to simply choose when and if to perpetuate life itself. And as we close this chapter on survival, we are left with an enduring understanding that while our methods have modernized from desperate folklore remedies to sophisticated pharmaceutical interventions, the underlying anxiety, the terrifying question of control, is still very much alive. The echoes of Chaucer's verses still linger. When we read the desperate couplets concerning reproductive avoidance, or peruse the fanciful herbal instructions from medieval texts, it is impossible not to feel the weight of that primal anxiety. The fear surrounding a single life, an unwanted pregnancy, was not just personal. It was a public, structural collapse from the panic in the great halls centuries ago, a fear so acute it necessitated everything from spiced poultices to genuine desperation. The journey we have traveled has been one marked by staggering leaps and equally monumental stumbles. The early methods were predicated on illusion. They relied on performance, on rituals of virtue, or on sheer hope. To prevent a conception was often more about maintaining social appearances than it was about actual chemistry. If the herbs failed, if the mysterious wand proved powerless, the failure was rarely attributed to inadequate knowledge or insufficient biology. Instead, blame settled upon the character of the woman or the moral failing of the man. The law and the folklore held the body accountable. The poison chapters forced us into a deep well of human desperation. We saw methods bordering on chemical warfare, evidence that when immediate control slipped away, humanity's response was to employ the most extreme means available. It painted a picture of a society teetering on the brink, where biological inevitability translated into existential crisis. And yet, look at the trajectory. From the whispered dangers of apothecaries selling costly spices to the cold clarity of the modern pharmaceutical package, the narrative is one of escalating anxiety management. We traded magical efficacy for chemical complexity. The problem never left us. It simply became more sophisticated and potentially more insidious. The dawn of genuine scientific understanding, the shift from humoral theory to molecular biology, was not a cure. It was an armamentarium. It gave humanity the illusion of certainty, packaging profound biological randomness into manageable schedules and discrete pills. We learned to control time itself, mapping potential reproductive life into 2 weeks before taking action. The revolution of the 20th century presented us with reliable, scalable technologies that were utterly unimaginable to the women standing in those overheated manor halls centuries earlier. The promise was profound. A degree of autonomy previously relegated only to goddesses or mythic figures. We finally had tools that made conception an event manageable on human terms rather than an overwhelming, inescapable societal guarantee. But this narrative is not merely one of progress. It demands a look at the dark undertow beneath every miracle pill and flawless procedure. Did modern science solve the dilemma of choice? Or did it simply commodify the struggle for control? The contemporary conversation around contraception, its regulation, its efficacy, its accessibility, is merely the latest iteration of the same enduring human anxiety that drove women to poultices and poisons in medieval times. The shift from Chaucer's verses to today's pill reveals less about profound wisdom than it does about refined management of persistent biological panic. We have substituted visceral terror with systemic reliance. Where once fear was local, physical, and immediate, a death in the night, or a curse laid upon the lineage, it is now global, mediated by advertising and medical protocols. The narrative we chart through these chapters suggests that the quest for absolute reproductive mastery is inherently flawed. The very act of attempting to permanently cage biological reality transforms necessity into an endless source of anxiety. It establishes a constant relationship between modern medicine and human fallibility. We are not free from consequence. We have merely exchanged the perils of folklore poisons for the subtle, complex dependencies on pharmaceutical cycles. Ultimately, our journey takes us to a point of detached, darkly humorous acceptance. We achieved something miraculous, the capacity for planning where once there was only raw inevitability. The sheer weight of what has been accomplished is staggering, but if we listen closely enough, past the smooth veneer of clinical certainty and chemical guarantee, we can still hear the distant echo of that primal dread. The terror in medieval times did not vanish. It merely mutated, becoming a more structured, more predictable, yet no less potent human folly. And so the story continues, proving that while our tools have evolved from herbs to hormones, the fundamental human desire for absolute control over destiny